right here on the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
Once again, we return to the Concord Museum. You may recall that they have a wonderful collection of artifacts from the colonial period. Today, we're here to see their classic Victorian-style gazebo, which is situated at the corner of the lawn next to the road. Turns out that this was built by an old friend of ours, Jack Rogers, several years ago. Let's look at some of the features. It's supported by some stones. It's close to the ground, and the decking is a southern yellow pine laid in the 8 segments of the octagon. The posts lead up to some collar ties, which keep the gazebo from spreading apart. On top of the collar ties, there are curved rafters, which are a lamination of wood strips. And on top of that, there's some 4-inch wide roof sheathing. What I really like about this gazebo is the way that the roof sweeps up to that wooden finial at the top. Now, Jack covered the roof with red cedar shingles, and then he capped all the ridges with red cedar shingles. Each opening has a nice decorative element, and there's a simple railing to close it in. Now, this is a little large for where we'd like to place our gazebo, but there are plenty of ideas here. I found a place for our gazebo in the woods out behind the shop, where I had a clearing that was about 10 feet in diameter. It's going to be a great place to come out to on a summer evening because we're going to screen ours in. In fact, there's going to be a screen door right here leading out through the garden. The first thing I did was the layout. I set a series of strings. First this one, then using a framing square, 90 degrees for this one. Then I bisected each angle. The result are strings that are 45 degrees to each other. Then I measured from a center stake and put a little mark on the line, which defines the outer point of the frame, so that I could set these solid concrete blocks. I removed the bark mulch and just made sure that the soil underneath was compacted. Then I leveled each block to one another. Now, if you'd like to build one of these gazebos, a measured drawing is available, and you'll hear more about that before the program ends. Now, to get started, we want to set the perimeter of the floor frame. These pieces are 2 by 6. Now, each piece is 3 foot, 6 5/8 inches long on the outside, and cut at a 22.5 degree angle. And I'll fasten them with some screws. Now, you'll notice that I'm using 2 by 6 pressure-treated lumber for the floor frame, which means it should last for many years. The gazebo that we looked at earlier had the floor decking system installed in segments, triangles. And the problem with that is that there are a lot of joints along each edge. And in time, the boards will curl, making it difficult to slide the furniture around, and you could even trip on them. So I've designed a much simpler floor system. My joists will run in this direction, 16 inches on center. The flooring will run perpendicular, giving me fewer joints. Well, now I'm ready to check for squareness. I want to measure from that corner to this corner, 9 foot 3 1/2. And I want to check the opposite diagonal, 9 foot 3 3/8. So I want to bring it this way just a little bit. 7/16. Good. Well, now a word about power tool safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. I cut the ends of these joists at 45 degrees to fit the perimeter. For the post, I bought pressure-treated 4 by 6s. And the first thing I want to do is bevel the narrow edges. To do that, I'm going to use my 12-inch radial arm saw, which allows me to make it in one pass. Otherwise, I'd have to use my table saw and set it up for 2 passes. Now the joiner does a nice job smoothing up the edges from the saw cut. Now to the radial arm to make the notches. I've installed my stacked dado head cutter in the radial arm, and I've screwed 2 wedges to the table. And they're actually made from scraps that were cut off the post. This way the post is positioned so that the notch will be 90 degrees to the side. The last notch to make on each post is up at the top. It's 1.5 inches wide, and it'll receive the collar ties. Now, I can't cut that with the dado head cutter, so I'm going to use a circular saw, make a series of passes through, and then chisel out the rest. My collar ties are 2x4s, and I've laid out a notch that I need, 1 on each end, where they fit over the tops of the post. Now this notch, and one like it in another collar tie, will give me a half-lap joint where they intersect. The collar tie extends beyond the post, and each end is cut at an angle to receive some trim. So I've tipped my radial arm saw to 22.5 degrees and swung the arm around to 33 degrees. Now I'm going to swing the radial arm to 33 degrees on the other side of 0 and finish the cut. To secure the post to the frame, I'm using 2 carriage bolts, 1 on each side of the joint. Now, with all the posts installed, it's time to put in some blocking and fillers to catch all the decking. Now, the 2x4s that wrap the top are the same length as the 2x6s that wrap the perimeter of the floor, and the angle on the end is 22.5 degrees. Okay, now it's time for the collar ties. And that'll really tie the top together and make it nice and stiff. Okay. Now the remaining collar ties, which have to be cut where they intersect in the middle, I'm cutting right out here on the job site with my sliding compound miter box. Now, using my circular saw and my jigsaw, I'm able to notch these pieces of 5/4 by 6 decking so that they fit in between the posts. Now I want to cut the end at 22.5 degrees where it meets the adjacent piece. To secure the decking, I'm using 8-penny stainless steel ring shank nails. They won't stain the wood or rust. Now for the field, I'm using more of the 5/4 by 6 decking, carefully fitting it between the perimeter. Now I started at the center, and I'm going to work my way to each edge. I will butt them up tightly because they'll shrink a little bit. It's going to take a little while. By the looks of the amount of light I got left, I won't be able to finish it tonight. Ah, there you are. Since I saw you last, I completed laying the field of the deck, carefully fitting the boards around the post and the perimeter pieces. Then I laid down a piece of plywood to protect the floor while I continue building the gazebo. This 2x4 post is temporary. It'll help support the ceiling joists, which I'm going to use as a scaffolding to frame the roof. I also took some time to put some braces and springboards to hold all the posts plumb while I frame the roof. Now, I've already installed 4 of the roof rafters, and you start to see the shape. It's going to be kind of neat. The rafters are actually made up of 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood laminated together. They have a slight curve that leads up to a king post. Both elements I made back at the shop. I start out forming the rafters by laying them out on some 3/4 inch plywood. Then I rough cut them with the jigsaw. With them fastened together in pairs, I'll perfect the cut at the bandsaw. Now I'm going to secure the pieces together using some construction adhesive. Next, I want to secure the pieces together with some 1¼ inch galvanized screws. Altogether, we'll need 8 of these. The next element of the roof framing system is the king post. It's the piece that goes at the top where all the rafters meet. I start out with a piece of stock about 10½ inches long and 5 1/8 inches square. I'm knocking off the corners at a 45-degree angle so that I get 8 equal sides. And that's how those elements were made. Now, when it comes to fastening the rafters to the top of the collar tie, there's no effective way to get nails in there. So I'm going to use these 1/2 inch plywood gussets, which bridge between the collar tie and the rafter. And I do that on both sides of each rafter. Now, where the rafters meet the king post, I'm toe-nailing them in with some 8-penny stainless steel nails. With 4 opposing rafters installed, I'll infill with the remaining 4. Here I've applied some rough 4-inch spruce boards on the roof, leaving a 3/4 inch space between them. This is known as skip sheathing, and it'll allow the wood shingles that I'm going to put on next to breathe. Now, this cleat right here along the rafter will just give me a guide to mark where I want to cut the boards off at the center of each rafter. Now, I've set my saw at about a 15-degree angle. Now, this is where a compound miter box comes in handy. I'm taking boards and making an 18-degree cut across the face and back cutting it at 15 degrees so that it'll fit up against the cut that I made with the circular saw. I've left them a little long. I'll go up the roof, trim it, and then repeat the process all the way around. $35.5. Each course gets shorter by 3 inches. How's it look? Maybe tomorrow we can start shingling it. Of course, before I can apply any roof shingles, I have to do the trim around the eave. And it's made up of two pieces. The first piece I want to install is the soffit, which I just trimmed. The front edge of the soffit is beveled at 30 degrees, and it's cut across the face at 22.5 degrees. The boards sit underneath the extensions of the collar ties and get nailed in place with some 6-penny stainless steel nails. The next board to apply is the fascia board. It's a piece of 1x8 that I've ripped down to 6¼ inches. The tricky cut to make is where the boards meet at the corner, but it's easy at the compound miter box. There are 2 angle settings I have to make at the miter box. First, the bevel, which is going to be a little over 20 degrees, and then the cut across the face, which is going to be a little over 11.5 degrees. Okay, now the length of this piece has to be measured across the top edge, long point to long point. It's about 50.5 inches. Well, like the gazebo that we saw earlier, I am going to use red cedar shingles on the roof. You may recall that the hips of that gazebo were capped with shingles, and that's okay on a large roof. But because our gazebo is smaller, I'm afraid that that cap will overpower the scale of the roof. So I'm just going to weave or braid the corners, and that's a job that takes patience. I got started by installing these temporary half-inch pieces of plywood on the fascia boards, and that will act as a guide for the overhang of the shingles. First thing I want to do is slide a shingle over to the corner and put a pencil mark along the hip and trim it. Now that's a little stronger than I'm going to need. I'll plane it to fit. Here's where the cleat comes in. Holding the shingle flush to the cleat, I'll install a couple nails. Now, using a block plane, I want to trim the shingle so that it's flush to this roof surface. Okay, that's good. Now we'll repeat the operation coming from this roof plane. Onto the cleat, and 2 more nails. Okay, now you can see where the patience comes in. You can't rush this job. Now this is the easy part, infilling between the 2 hips. As long as I remember to leave about 1/8 to 1/4 inch gap to allow for the expansion of the shingles. Now I have to repeat the process again, going over this course, being sure to stagger the joints. Now to double up the starter course. I start at the hip, doubling the shingle that I put on the hip last. Now to make it look right and be sure that no water runs under the shingles, I want to slide this course down an additional 1/8 inch. Now here's the seam of the starter course, and here's the bevel. Now I want to plane this shingle flush to this roof plane. Okay, now we'll cover this with a shingle. Okay, with that little tip removed, you can see here's the top joint. So if any water gets in there, it's going to land on the shingle beneath and run out because the closest joint is way over here, about 1 inch away. Okay, now that's the first course that's going to show. 17 or 18 courses more to go, times 8, means I have 144 more of these braids to go. And that's going to take some time, a couple of days, I think. Now, next time, we'll finish the trim out here, build some screens, railings, and decoration. So until then, I'm Norm Abram, shingling away here at the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship.
That's next, right here on the new Yankee Workshop.
The new Yankee Workshop features the craftsmanship of Norm Abram.
It took many, many hours to complete the wood shingling of the roof. Because remember, every course had to be braided 8 times over those hips. But I think all the effort was worth it. Because when you approach a gazebo, after all, it's the roof that you notice first. I've already started setting the trim and the lattice panels. Let me show you that. The first thing I want to do is put a corner board on the outside of each post. Now, if you remember from the first program, I beveled the 4x6 post so that they would be square to each segment of the octagon. Now what I want to do is take the scrap piece of material that resulted from making that bevel and fill in the outside. I'll hold the thin part of the bevel even with the edge of the post, and that will give me a 90-degree corner right here. Now a word about safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these, safety glasses. Now the corner boards themselves are pieces that have been ripped at a 22.5-degree angle so that they'll fit together just like this to fit over the corner. Now, I could nail them in place as they are, but it would be very difficult to keep the outside edge aligned. So what I'm going to do is cut some biscuit slots to help align the two pieces. Okay, now we can put in some biscuits. I'm not going to use any glue. These biscuits are really just to align the two boards. The nails will actually hold them together. Okay, now I put a little mark on the decking, which is a ½ inch beyond the post, which is the overlap that I want. So with that aligned, just nail it in place. Now this piece of 2x4 that I've notched each end on to fit around the corner for it will just become a nailer for some other pieces of trim. Just secured with screws. The next thing I want to do is set the lattice railing panels. And they sit on some little blocks. Okay, now I can take the lattice panel, set it from the inside against the corner board and on top of the blocks. Then take some shingle tips and just wedge it in place. Now this piece of pine trim has also been notched on each end, and it sits under the 2x4 that I installed earlier. Next, a couple fillers on each side of the opening at the top. The next thing is the upper lattice panel, which has a decorative arch, and that gets tacked in place with a couple brads. Okay, now I can remove this temporary cleat, which is really just necessary to hold the arch until it was installed. You're probably wondering how I made this decorative arch and the lattice railing panel. Here's how it was done. The railing panels start out as 4 pieces of 1 inch thick by 1 3/8 wide cedar. And the first thing I want to do is plow a groove down the center to receive the lattice panel. And I'll run all 4 side pieces. Okay, that takes care of the miters on the frame pieces. Now the lattice panel. Because there are 7 panels to make and they're all identical, I thought it would be worthwhile to make a jig. So I took a piece of scrap particle board and laid out the perimeter. Here's the bottom, here's one side, a line across the top, and on the other side. Then I took some scrap pieces of lattice and fastened them to the particle board as spacers for the lattice pieces that run in this direction. Each piece is cut long enough so that it exceeds the layout lines. Now the lighter pieces are actually a 1/2 inch thick, and they are the spacers for the lattice that runs perpendicular to the first set. Okay, now with all the pieces in the jig, I'm going to secure the overlapping intersections with a brad. Now I just transfer the line onto the lattice and trim it off. Ah, good. Now I thought it would be worthwhile to pre-prime the groove on the frame. Otherwise it's going to be difficult to paint later. Now all I have to do is slip the frame parts around the lattice, and I'll secure each corner with a screw. And there'll only be 6 more panels to build. To make the decorative arches, I return to the jig that I used to make the railings. The arches are a little bit wider and shorter than the railings, so I had to establish new lines for the sides and a new line for the bottom. I also installed this plywood block with a dowel pin in it so that I can use my router to actually trim out the arch. I've pre-cut the pieces of lattice a little bit longer than what I need, and we'll just set those in place. As I place the lattice in the other direction, I'm adding a spot of waterproof glue at every intersection, and that's because the decorative arch does not have as much support as the railing. You might have noticed that I'm holding my brad nailer at an angle when I drive the brads. That's because the smallest brad for this nailer is 5/8 of an inch. If I held it straight, the brads would go through. By holding it at an angle, they won't. Well, now for the router to cut a perfect half circle. I've attached this extension base, which is a homemade one that I used for a project earlier. You can buy these made out of acrylic material from your woodworking catalogs. I want to drop the base over the pivot point. And I've installed a 3/8 inch spiral cutting bit in the router. And because I'm going to be cutting across the end grain of a lot of these pieces, I want to take my time, but it works great. Well, just as with the railings, I'm trimming the edges with my small circular saw. To finish off the inside of the arch, I've ripped a piece of cedar that's a little over a 1/2 inch wide, and it's 3/16 of an inch thick. I've rolled on some waterproof glue. I'm going to try to bend it around the inside of the arch and hope that it doesn't break. Okay, now we'll put a little piece of trim right here. Now this is just a temporary piece that I'm putting across the bottom of the arch. This trim wants to make it spread out. We'll remove it when I install it at the gazebo. Now it took a little time to make the jigs to form these panels, but in the end it saves time. Now the next piece that has to go in is this filler piece that goes from the top of the lower panel up underneath the arch. Now there's another piece that goes on the inside at the top of the arch. Now another filler piece down the side of the arch lattice panel. And the final filler piece goes on the inside of the railing panel. All those fillers give me a uniform surface against which the screen panel will sit. Well, you know, our gazebo can also be called a summer house, which means people are going to want to use it during the summertime. To keep the bugs out, I've come up with a system of screens, and I made those in the shop. Going to the screen shop to have screens made can be expensive, but if you know a couple tricks, you can make custom screens in your own workshop. Now, I've joined parts of screens together in the past using these corrugated fasteners. You drive them across the joint. Sometimes they go in successfully, sometimes they split, and they're very difficult to drive if you hit a knot. Now, that technology has been replaced by biscuits or plate joinery. These beechwood biscuits, combined with the 1-part waterproof glues, will make a joint that's indestructible. Now, to make the slot for the biscuit, you need a biscuit joiner. And inside there's a blade. As you push the machine forward, it cuts a slot the right size for the biscuit. The layout is done by just putting a pencil line across the joint where you want the biscuit. Now we can clamp it together. You've seen me do this countless times. Check for squareness. 88 and 9/16 across that diagonal. And across this one, we have 88 and 3/8. So I got to knock this corner down just a little bit and check it again. That's perfect. After assembling all 7 screen frames and allowing the glue to dry, it was such a nice day that I took the frames outside and applied the final coats of paint. It's a lot easier to do that first before setting the screen fabric. Now what I want to do is put the fabric on, and to do that I'm going to start by setting the screen frames end to end. You notice I need to have 2 frames at a time to do this. Now the screen fabric is fiberglass, and I found that it's less expensive to buy a 100-foot roll rather than the individual pieces. I really only need about 60 feet, but I'll have some spare one around should I need to make a repair. I roll it out to the end of the frame and square it up, roll it over the edge, and attach it with a few temporary staples. All right. Now I can go down to the other end and with a nice sharp mat knife, cut it off a couple inches longer. And roll it over this edge and staple it. Now, if you think that's tight, here's the trick. I'm going to raise this screen up so that I can take a scrap piece of stock that's about 1 inch wide and put it in between the two screen frames. Now, if I let the screen back down again, it's going to stretch the fabric so that it's nice and tight. Look at how tight that is. Now, I'm going to staple along the edge about 3/8 of an inch in from the opening every 6 inches. Okay, with the last staple in place, I can separate the screens and put the moldings on. Good. Okay, I started out by cutting all the pieces of molding a little bit longer than what I need because I'm going to miter the corners. Now, this piece of molding was picked up at the lumberyard, and it's called screen molding, sort of a modified half round. To make the miters, I'm going to use my lightweight miter box that has a really fine blade. That makes a nice, clean cut. To hold the moldings in place, I'm using a brad about 3/4 of an inch long. Now here at the mid-rail, I'm using 2 pieces of molding, and no attempt is made to miter it, just a butt joint. And I'll leave this screen material in the center. Now here around the perimeter, I will trim off the excess fabric. Okay, 1 down, 6 to go. The screen door is made using the same techniques that I used for the screen frames, except that I'm using 5/4 stock instead of 3/4 stock, and I'm using double biscuits at the joints for extra strength. Okay, that's nice and square. Now I'll set it aside to dry, put the finished coats of paint on it, and apply the screen fabric the same way I did with the screen panels. Now, before I can install the screens, I need to put in 1 more piece of trim on the inside. I've installed a couple pieces of scrap wood at the top on each side against the posts, and now I'm going to put this piece of 1x10 in and nail it in place. The top of each screen slips under the piece of trim that I just installed. Then I push it up against the lattice and center it in the opening. And it'll be held in place with nothing more than a piece of 1/2 inch 1/4 round, which is secured with some 1 inch brads. Well, now for the door. The door will be in swinging, but I have to set some stops up against it, which it'll close. So there's a piece of 5/4 pine that gets set up at the top. Now on the hinge side of the door, I've already mortised some galvanized hinges into the post, but I need a piece of trim against which the door will close. Another piece of 5/4 up against the corner board. And on the latch side, another piece of 5/4. All the pieces will be secured with some stainless steel nails. Well, all right, that should keep the bugs out. Now on the outside, there's a couple more pieces of trim to complete. Around the bottom, there's a 1x6 skirt board that's cut at 22.5 degrees on each end. Now to dress up where the skirt board meets the flooring, a piece of scotia mold. Now just below the soffit, I'm installing another 1x6 all the way around the gazebo. This is known as a freeze board. The angle that I've cut at each intersection is the same as I used on the water table, and it sits on top of the corner board. The final piece of wood is this one, a cornice molding, and that's going to dress up the intersection between the freeze board and the soffit. And now for the final touch, a finial. Now, I didn't make this in the workshop. It was made by a very talented friend and coppersmith, Paul Spahn, out in California. And it goes right up there. All right. Now, this is going to fit right over the top of the shingles. And we'll get it plumb. And I'm going to secure it with some brass screws and some rubber washers to keep the water out. Well, how's it look? Pretty good? Well, now that you know how it's done, I hope that you'll build one.